Glenn Greenwald is with us. He's author of the new book, With Liberty and Justice for Some. He's also a contributing writer over at Salon.com. And I want to talk to you, Glenn, about immunity and impunity in elite America, how the legal system was deep six and Occupy Wall Street swept the land. The most interesting point that I took from it is that income and wealth inequality have been present for a really long time in the United States. So that alone, even though it's kind of become the de facto number one cited reason for Occupy Wall Street, in your opinion, can't really be enough to have spurred this incredible coming together of events that are these protests. So, number one, what else has been a factor? But more interestingly, number two, why has that become such a convenient and popular number one reason that we're hearing?
Right. Well, it's not just that income inequality and wealth inequality have been in the United States for a long time, although that is true. What also is true is that it has been significantly increasing for several decades. So the trend line has been towards greater and greater levels of inequality. And yet you didn't really see a sustained protest movement over inequality. And I think the reason for that is because Americans are basically inculcated, for better or for worse, to accept not just the inevitability, but the virtues of inequality, of wealth inequality and outcome inequality. So, for example, when someone like Steve Jobs dies with $7 billion or $8 billion in net worth, even though huge amounts of joblessness and homelessness and foreclosures and the like are sweeping the land, most people don't begrudge that because there's this sort of embedded political value in the United States that inequality is legitimate as long as it's fair and just. And I think that's really the key behind this protest movement, and what has so radically changed is the perception, obviously correct in my view, that these inequalities are no longer the byproduct of merit or hard work or deserved achievement, but instead is really the byproduct of cheating, of people shielding their ill-gotten gains, and most of all, using their superior political and financial power to exempt themselves from the rule of law, from the rules of society to which the rest of us are bound, so that these inequalities are no longer legitimate but are illegitimate. And I think that's really what's sustaining the protest, and one of the reasons why you don't hear much about that and why the media has an interest in portraying this as nothing more than just sort of anger over inequality unto itself is because one of the ways of demonizing the protest or dismissing it is to say that it's nothing more than this sort of socialist or communist anger from the 1960s over the fact that some people have a lot and lazy and worthless people have very little. And I think that's clearly not what the protest movement is about by and large. It's about the fact that, for example, the people who collapsed the world economy through their illegality and criminality have not paid any price, but instead have prospered.
You know, what I think is interesting is that there's several layers actually to the defenses and criticisms of Occupy Wall Street. And we've actually now seen on Twitter over the weekend, I got a ton of messages after a piece we did talking about media coverage of the Tea Party versus media coverage of Occupy Wall Street. And I got a serious email. It wasn't a parody. It wasn't sarcastic, saying, look at how many people have been arrested at Occupy Wall Street, and look at how many people were arrested at the Tea Party protest. You guys got to be nuts for thinking there's anything about the people happening at Occupy Wall Street. They're all getting arrested. And it's impossible for that. There's nothing I can say to that person to explain to them how actually the disparity in the arrests is indicative of the problem, not of how great the Tea Party is. I've lost that person, right? I can't bring them back.
Well, of course, that's true. And there's, but I will say this. One of the driving attributes of the Occupy movement that, in my view, makes it so worthwhile and compelling is that it really is a protest from the political and legal culture as a whole, from political and legal institutions. So it's really intended to exist outside of the legal framework. Whereas the Tea Party movement, certainly there was lots of civil disobedience going on there. People were bringing guns. It was much more threatening and disruptive in its own way. But I think that the Occupy movement really was intended and is intended to purposely create a space that doesn't exist within our prevailing legal institutions. And so the fact that people are getting arrested is certainly in part due to the fact that the status quo authorities see people who are protesting inequality as being just kind of troublemakers and antagonizers and people who really deserve to be in jail. There's definitely that bias. But a part of it is that the occupations are by design be growing without legal sanction. And so the more threatening they become to those in power, I think it's just inevitable that those in power are going to start to treat it as being threatening and to use their force and coercion against it, which includes arrest. But the one thing I will say is that, by and large, although the media reaction has been quite negative and scornful and patronizing, polls continuously show that large pluralities, if not majorities, are sympathetic to the message of the Occupy movement, because most people do indeed know that our legal and political institutions are radically broken, and that meaningful change is possible only by working outside of them.
Sure, and it's no surprise when we look over the years at polls, fairly asked polls asking people, do you think the government has a fundamental responsibility to provide you health care? And the overwhelming majority of people, usually 2/3 or even more, do think so, but you don't see that reflected in the politicians that are elected. You don't see that reflected in the policy that is proposed in any kind of serious way other than, every once in a while Dennis Kucinich mentioning it. So it should be no surprise to us that policy does not at all reflect the will of the people, does it?
Well, but this is, that's an important point about why the occupation movement has emerged and why it continues to flourish and the driving force behind it. Of course, politicians do go before the public and claim that they share the sentiments that polls reveal are embraced by majorities and promise to carry out that agenda. And huge numbers of people in 2008 were persuaded by the Obama campaign that electing Barack Obama would result in those policies being implemented. And in fact, I think the most significant thing about the 2008 campaign with respect to the Occupy Wall Street movement is that the Obama candidacy really specifically targeted those people who had decided that working within the political system was no longer worthwhile, or that who had always concluded that it wasn't worthwhile. People who, as Obama described them, were sort of wallowing in this corrosive cynicism. And that's what all of this, stuff about Yes We Can and Audacity of Hope was designed to do, was to persuade specifically those people that there was a reason, there was a value to them devoting their time, energy, and resources to electing a Democratic candidate, that things would actually change. And when they did that and they saw that nothing changed, that everything continued as is, that the same factions continued to be served, that was really what increased the cynicism more than it had ever existed before. And it's what led so many people to the conclusion, well, if it didn't happen here, it's never going to happen. And now I realize that the only viable course of action is to work outside of this system, is to dissent from it and to change the political culture rather than working for one party or the other. And I think that is a huge energy behind this movement, is the anger and disappointment and sense of betrayal that people feel from 2008.
My last question for you, Glenn, is do you think that Occupy Wall Street will play a real role in the 2012 election? And let me qualify that by saying I don't mean offhanded references from either or both candidates when it's politically convenient to mention Occupy Wall Street. But do you think in any real way this will affect the upcoming presidential election?
I do. I think it'll affect it in the sense that there'll be more rhetorical attention paid to the issue of wealth and income inequality, not just offhanded remarks as you suggested, but more time being spent on it, which is a positive thing. But I think the real impact that it possibly might have is that if the Obama campaign perceives, and I think this is the real risk that they're worried about already, that so much of the energy of the youth vote and the first-time vote that drove him into office in 2008 is instead being directed to the Occupy movement rather than the Obama re-election 2012 campaign, then I think there's going to be a serious effort on the part of Obama to at least create the appearance that he's more concerned with the issues that are occupying the occupation movement than he actually is. And so I think you're going to start to see some greater tactical shifts to target those people. But, ultimately, at the end of the day, both of those major party candidates are going to need to get funding from corporate and Wall Street interest, and that's the real constituency that they're going to end up serving. So the biggest impact may be on the fact that it just gives people another outlet besides electoral politics to express their discontent, and that could certainly have an impact on the outcome of the election.
Glenn Greenwald, of course, over at Salon.com, and the new book is With Liberty and Justice for Some. Really great to talk to you, Glenn. Keep up the great work.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.